good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicola Howe. I'm from the Australian Water Association. I just want to do a short introduction ahead of our webinar today. I'll be your host for this session. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. This webinar is part of our Where's the Water series with the Bureau of Meteorology, which started a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Paul Faithmer, whose webinar was about water forecasting. Some of you may have also joined previous discussions hosted by the AWA about such as El Nino and water resources, which were run in December last year. As you may be aware, the Bureau's Water Information Programme is building a comprehensive and reliable picture of Australia's water resources to support its policy and planning. It provides nationally consistent water information as part of its role and responsibilities under the Water Act 2007. Today's webinar will help you to understand how a countrywide water picture can assist decision making and why national perspective is so important in assessing and accounting for water resources. We hope.
Joining the conference is
Catherine. I'll just move slightly closer to the microphone so you can hear us slightly better. Okay. Notice that a few of you are having problems with the sound, so I've moved slightly closer. So soon I'll be introducing Janice Green, who'll be your presenter for the session. We'll be recording the session to provide you with a link to the recording later on, so you don't need to make too many notes, that will be provided to you. Ahead of us kicking off, I just want to mention, as many of you have discovered, the box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screens is really helpful to be able to make comments as you've been doing about the sound. So hopefully you'll be able to make improvements on that. At the top of the thread, you'll notice that there's a set of contact numbers. So if you have any tech problems, there is a support line which you can get in touch with our web hosting provider. So they'll be able to provide you with support directly to deal with the tech. If you want to dial in separately, if you're having problems and want to enter into the audio only call, there's numbers on there as well. You just need to make sure you put those in accurately and use the passcode to be able to access it via that mechanism. We have the opportunity to ask Janice questions using this box as well, so make sure that you, any questions that you have, you just make a note in the box as you go along. Janice will be answering the questions at the end. If we don't get through all of the questions, we'll be getting in touch with you after the webinar to be able to make sure that you get all the information that you're looking for. So moving on to the webinar itself, Janice Green joins us from the Bureau's Canberra office. Janice is the manager of the Bureau's Water Accounting and Regulations section. She's got the responsibility for the preparation of the National Water Accounts, for the provision of water market information, and for managing the regulations of the Water Act governing supply of water data to the Bureau. In addition, she is Project Director for the IFD Revision Project, being undertaken as part of the revision of Australian rainfall and runoff. Janice has 30 years' experience in hydrology, hydraulics, and water resource management, working in state and Commonwealth government agencies and the private sector. She holds a Bachelor of Natural Resources and a Master's of Engineering Science. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Janice.
Thanks, Nicola. Australia has a highly variable rainfall. We're all familiar with this, and we've all experienced the periods of drought and of flooding rains. And in the December webinar, Andrew Watkins explained to us some of the climate drivers that actually make our rainfall so variable. Australia also has a very highly variable stream flow, one of the most highly variable across the world. As a consequence, Australia has a very harsh hydroclimate, one of droughts and flooding rains, as Dorothea McKellar so eloquently put it over 100 years ago. What I want to talk about today is the impact that our harsh hydroclimate has on managing our water resources, and why access to good long-term information is crucial to good management of water resources. In Australia, we frequently lurch from flood to drought, and The hardships that caused by these two extremes is etched into the psyche of many Australians. The Federation drought, the drought during World War II, and most recently in the one that we can all remember, which is the Millennium drought. Conversely, Australians are also impacted by floods, the 1955 floods in the Hunter Valley, the widespread flooding that occurred in the 1970s, and of course, the Brisbane floods in 2011. This harsh climate of ours is also reflected in the amount of moisture that's contained in the soil. If you look at the soil moisture profile, it's the first metre, the root zone, that is most important to agriculture. This is where the money is in for agriculture. Looking at a map of soil moisture across Australia, the areas where it's red is where the soil moisture for this particular year, 1911, was below average. And the reddest areas are where the lowest soil moisture on record was recorded. Conversely, the blue areas show where the soil moisture was above average, and where we have the very dark blue, that's where the highest soil moisture recorded was shown. If we now look at a 104-year simulation of soil moisture, we can see the years when there was widespread areas of very deep, very low soil moisture. So we can see the drought years. And then where the years we've got widespread, very deep blue years, this corresponds to the flood years. So we're coming up to the 60s where we had drought, and then moving into the 70s, we have widespread flood years. Isn't this a really great video? I love watching it, and could usually spend quite an afternoon watching it. This very harsh climate of ours makes it difficult for water managers to manage Australia's water resources and to know the answer to questions on water security and whether the reliability of entitlements is changing, on allocations and who exactly is entitled to use water, when they're using it, and under what conditions, and also looking at environmental flows. How much water is allocated to the environment and when. The difficulty in knowing how to answer these questions was really brought home during the Millennium drought, when many parts of Australia, and especially in the eastern states, experienced record low rainfalls and also record low levels in dams. And we also saw the impact of the Millennium drought on our rivers and also on agriculture. Back in 2006, it was realised that while individual states held a lot of information which would enable them to answer these questions for their particular state or region, from a national perspective, it wasn't possible to answer seemingly simple questions as how much water is available, how much water is being allocated, who's using it and how much are they using it. And it emphasised how critical it was to have good long-term information on water storages, water sources, and in particular water sources other than the traditional surface water. The importance of having this information across all timescales, from hours for emergency management through to decades for supply augmentation. Information across all timescales provides us with situational awareness. This is the day-to-day management. If we have information, we know how we best can manage our water resources on a day-to-day. It also provides us with foresight, which allows us to forecast what might happen in the future. And Paul Fakenmar discussed water water forecasting last month in his webinar. But what I want to talk about today is perspective, so that we can make longer term water management decisions using information on what has happened over the past years and decades, and make better decisions because of this. Since 2007, and coming out of the fact that back in 2006 we couldn't answer on a national basis the seemingly simple questions, the Bureau of Meteorology has had responsibility for collating and archiving water information that's collected by a range of data providers across Australia, and of archiving this information and then providing it to users. So by the end of 2015, we had 33 million data files, which had been provided by 178 data providers. And this comprised 4 billion time series observations. Now, that's a lot of data. And what's the data that we have on? It provides us information about rivers and lakes, reservoirs, groundwater, desalinated plants, and recycling water plants. You name it, we've got it. And what I want to do today is just take a quick look at some of this information that we have available. Large water storages are an essential part of managing water resources in Australia. My English relatives, where a week without rain is considered to be a drought, can't understand what we mean by big dams. But what we're talking about, and as you know, are the big storages such as Copeton Dam in northern New South Wales, which is a massive dam that can store over 1 million megalitres. But we need to know information about how to optimise operation of these large storages. We need to know that Copeton can go from less than 10% capacity in the beginning of 2010 to nearly over 90% capacity at the end of 2011, and that it will fall again back down, and at the moment it's back about 20%. We need to know information on when to enlarge dams. So for example, enlarged dams such as Cotter Dam near Canberra, which the analyses using long-term information advised that in order to secure the water supply for Canberra, it needed to be enlarged. It also needed to be enlarged for flood security risk. We also need long-term information to know when we need to seek information from other water cycles, other water sources such as desalination plants or recycled water. We need information to know when to build water storages, desalination plants, and when to build recycled plants. How many of you in the did you know questions, how many of you actually knew that there were 92 desalination plants across Australia, or 268 recycling plants? I've been working in the water industry for over 30 years, and if you'd asked me before I saw the map of desal plants how many, I would have thought, well, probably one each capital city. But no, we've got 92 desalination plants that provide us with a climate resilient source of water. It also provides us with information on when to bring on these desal plants. So for example, Wonthaggi desal plant near Melbourne has just received its first orders for desalinated water because the storage volume in Melbourne's collective water storages has dropped below 65%, which is the trigger for bringing Wonthaggi online. We need to have access to long-term streamflow records so that we can calibrate hydrologic models to use them to simulate water resource management options. So we need to know, looking at the Gwydir Valley again, we need to know that there's been a stream gauge on the Gwydir River at Gravesend Road Bridge since 1955. And we need to be able to know what period of record there is and how much of the information we have available, and also what gauges are available around it and what the length of record they have. However, if we want to undertake a streamflow trend analysis or to model natural flow conditions, so for example, if we're wanting to know what flows would have gone down the Gwydir River before Copeton Dam was built, the 60 years of streamflow record at Gravesend gauge aren't really going to help us because apart from the changes in land use that have taken place over the past 60 years, since the 1970s there's been a whopping great dam, Copeton, upstream of the gauge, which has affected flows. So we need to know where there are gauges on unimpaired catchments, such as the Gwydir River at Yarrawick, which is one of our hydrologic reference stations. And this is, if you like, the cream of our gauging stations information. It's the long-term streamflow analysis, but they're on unimpaired catchments, so that if we want to look at trend analysis, if we want to see how the climate is impacting on streamflows, we can use this set of hydrologic reference stations. Once we've calibrated our hydrologic models and we want to use them to design infrastructure such as culverts or stormwater drains or flood levees, we need design rainfalls, or IFDs as you may know them. And we need IFDs that have been derived using the longest period of record, long-term rainfall records, so that it takes into account the climate variations, the times of drought, the times of flooding rains that we get across Australia. And we need to have the information that's being collected from organisations all around Australia, not just the Bureau's own rainfall records, and in particular the short-term, the 1 minute, the 5 minute rainfall data that urban utilities collect. And these data are now provided all to the Bureau and enable us to use them in the estimation of design rainfalls. When we move into drought and our surface water supplies start to dry up, in many areas of Australia, we start relying more and more on groundwater. Did you know that there are over 800,000 bore sites across Australia? That's an enormous number of sites where groundwater is being accessed. However, there has tended to be a bit of an out of sight, out of mind attitude with groundwater, which, coupled with the fact that groundwater has such long recharge periods, it means managing groundwater is even more difficult than managing surface water. Surface water we can see. We know when our rivers are very low. We know when our rivers are getting polluted. But this type of information on groundwater hasn't been available. Once again, it's been available at individual state levels. However, aquifers don't tend to recognise state boundaries. So this information needs to be available on a national basis so that we can look at groundwater usage. We can look at the trends in groundwater levels on an aquifer basis across states. And so, for example, for the Moree site downstream of Copeton Dam, where we can see there's quite a few groundwater bores, we can get information for the bores on what's happening with the water level. Is it being drawn down? What's happening when we do have drought periods? And when we do have drought periods, are we pulling the groundwater down too far? How long is it taking for the aquifers to recover? What's the recharge like? And once again, all this information is now available on a national basis, which makes managing groundwater in an effective way far more achievable, because we do have this long-term information available. Now, it's not just rural areas which rely more and more on groundwater, especially during droughts. We can see here that in Perth, where the brown shows us over the past 5 years, the proportion of groundwater that Perth uses to supply its urban water supply. And you can see that over 50% of Perth's urban water supply comes from groundwater. We can also see that over the recent years, we can see there's actually been a decline in reliance on groundwater for Perth, but there has been an increase in desalinated water as being used for urban water supply. This graph also shows us the other cities that are relying more and more on desalinated water. So, for example, Adelaide, where over recent years they've been using desalinated water. And we can also see that Sydney, during 2011-2012, they were also relying on desalinated water for their urban supply, but the past couple of years they haven't used it. As I said, Wonthaggi is now coming online in Victoria. So next year, when we produce these graphs, it's going to show us that there's a usage, a proportion of the urban water supply for Melbourne has been provided for from desalination. As you can see, the Bureau now provides access to a wide range of long-term information. So much information that it can be seen a bit like, data everywhere. How do we actually use it? So in addition to collating the data and making it available, we also analyse the data and provide a number of water status reports where we've collated the information, we've undertaken an assessment, and this means that for individual regions or for Australia as a whole, we can provide an analysis and assessment of the information that's there. I just want to talk about two of these. One is the National Water Account and the other is Water in Australia. The National Water Account marries the science of hydrology with the financial accounting models. Now, as Nicola said, I manage the water accounting section. I'm still deciding whether it's a marriage made in heaven or a marriage in hell, but it does provide us with a lot of information. It tells us the sources of water and where the water's been used. It tells us inflows, outflows. It tells us whether we're in debit or in credit. So that's where the accounting comes in. It lets us know how we're going with our budgeted amount of water each year. It's reported each financial year. It's reported for the 10 biggest water reusing regions across Australia. So you can see you've got the Daily and the Ord in Northern Australia. It provides information for these areas where we're looking at developing Northern Australia. It provides us with long-term information and assessment of the trends over the past 5 or 6 years of water usage, water availability. It also looks at Perth, at Adelaide, at Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Southeast Queensland, the Burdekin, which is the newest of our regions, and of course the Murray-Darling Basin, which forms such a large part of the eastern seaboard of Australia. And if the thought of reading even a water account puts you to sleep, this year, as we did last year, we were providing a video that you can watch, which gives an overview of the national summary for just 3 minutes, and it's probably a bit more palatable than sitting down and reading the whole account. Although for individual regions, going to the National Water Account site for your region provides a lot of conceptual information in addition to the actual water accounts. The water accounts the National Water Accounts mean that we're now far better placed to answer the questions that we couldn't answer on a national basis back in the Millennium drought. That is, how much water is available, how much water has been allocated, used, lost to recharge groundwater lost in evaporation, and how much water has been traded within basins and interbasin transfers. How much water is in our rivers and aquifers, and how is that availability of water changing both in the short term when we're looking at a drought such as the Millennium drought, but also, as I said before, when we're talking about groundwater, how long is it taking for the groundwater that we tend to rely on during drought times to recover through recharge? And also, how is the rate and pattern of water use changing? Are we using more water in our cities as we all have dishwashers, as more and more of us have swimming pools, and being able to track those trends? And it also helps us to look at, well, if we are using more water in our cities, if we are using more water in our irrigation areas, what's the water availability outlook looking like? Back in nearly 12 months ago, we had headlines such as the one in the Sydney Morning Herald, which tells us that El Nino is back. Since then, we've backed off from that, and the ENSO indicator's now looking like moving into neutral. But what it told us back 12 months ago was that if we were moving into a bad El Nino, we're in a much better position to manage our water, to know how much water we have and how we have to manage it, than we were back in the Millennium drought when we couldn't answer these questions. It also means that we now know how to respond in terms of when do we build new desalination plants, when do we bring these desalination plants online, so that the decisions can be made in the medium to long term for building infrastructure, rather than making them in the short term when our storage levels are dropping so low. But the National Water Account doesn't just enable us to answer these questions, the questions that we couldn't answer back in the Millennium drought. It allows us to answer broader questions, and it allows us to compare questions, compare the status on a national basis. So, for example, as I showed the map before, we've got 268 recycling plants. We can now look across each capital city and say, well, what proportion of recycled water is being used to source urban water for each capital city? We can compare over the past 5 to 6 years between cities, how urban water utilities, how much water they have available and what the use was. So we can compare Perth to Southeast Queensland. We can compare where Adelaide is getting its water to Perth and Sydney. If we move to the rural sector, we can compare in different irrigation areas what the irrigator entitlements were and the water availability for different irrigators across different parts of Australia during previous years. And this helps us to assess what the different conditions are in irrigation areas in different parts of Australia. It also helps us to understand not just what's happening in the regions and at particular allocation sites, but also how the water's been traded across Australia. Are we having water moving in and out of river basins? How's that impacting on the river levels, the availability of water in not just the basin where the water is allocated, but the basins into which the water is being transferred. And it also allows us to compare what the balance between environmental and non-environmental water, so water that's used for irrigation, water that's used for urban water supply, for industry. What's the balance between the amount of water that's being provided back to the environment compared to the amount of water that's being used for other uses? And it also allows us to be able to compare in the Burdekin region, Are we providing more water for the environment than we are, for example, in the Murray-Darling Basin? And this allows us not just to be able to undertake good water resource management in states, in basins, but across the whole of Australia. A companion document to the National Water Count is the Annual Water in Australia. And this is an assessment report. It looks across the whole of Australia. It compares the water situation across Australia for previous years, and it synthesises the information for water in Australia in the context of climatic conditions. So looking at the amount of rainfall, looking at temperature, looking at evaporation, and saying, under these climatic conditions, what was the water? Where was it used? And it allows us, the first Water in Australia was released released last year. And as we build on each year providing an annual Water in Australia, it will allow us to tell the story of water usage across Australia. It will provide us with a national insight, and it provides us with integrated information. So it will allow us to know information about desalinated capacity compared to how much desalinated water was actually used, and recycled water compared to the amount of effluent. So how much effluent, we produce an enormous amount of effluent each year, but how much of that is actually being treated and reused? And it gives us across Australia an indication of the total water use around Australia. Now, all I've been able to give you over the past 40 or so minutes is just a snapshot of the information that we have. The Bureau provides a suite of, in addition to the actual information that the Bureau provides on individual types of data, such as stream flow, such as rainfall, such as groundwater levels. The Bureau also provides a suite of products which covers historical information and trends, the current status of our water resources. It enables us to provide forecasts from 7 days out to 3 months in terms of what's going to happen. You know, we marry these with the climate forecast and then look at what's going to happen in terms of the catchment response and our stream flow forecasts. And we also provide modelling tools for planning and for engineering. And this information is used for a range of uses by water resource managers, by hydrologists. It's used for infrastructure design. It's used for flood guidance. The flood forecasting is one of the Bureau's traditional products, but we're now providing not just the real-time forecasts, but we're also providing the 7-day forecasts, the seasonal forecasts. It provides information for water resources planning because we now have this long-term information. It enables the development of river management and environmental flows policy, for water sharing planning, and for policy advice. And it also, and this is particular where we're looking at the water market information that the Bureau now has custodian of. It provides information for the investment and rural financing. Now, it's just a suite of the services that the Bureau provides, and this slide will be provided to you at the end of this webinar, and there'll also be some documents provided, just short information sheets, and Nicola will provide you with the details of how to access this. But these links will take you to the products that I've talked about, the design rainfalls, the IFDs, the stream flow, so water data online, where you can see the information on stream flow, the hydrologic reference stations, that the cream of our stream flow stations, if you like, which are the ones on the unimpaired catchments, the modelled soil moisture, which is updated on a daily basis and which you can download, or if you become a registered user, you can download the information for the past 105 years. Water storages, which is available both on our web page and also as an app. The information about the recycled and desalination plants. The National Water Account for both 2015, which is the current one, but also for previous years, and also for water in Australia. You can go in and have a look and a play with some of those products. However, the Bureau will be having a trade stand at Ozwater in a couple of weeks' time. So if you want to know some more information about any of these products, or if you'd like to find out about the suite of other products that we have, please come by our trade stand and have a chat to us, and we can walk you through the products there and introduce you to some of the other ones. And also, if you want to receive regular updates on the Water Information Program's products, please subscribe to Enviro News via this link. And of course, if you haven't already done so, register for Ozwater now. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much, Janice. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I'll also give the opportunity to those delegates who are dialing in via audio only to ask some questions to you. So the first question is from Merrin via the webinar, and she says that she'd be interested in seeing the visual summary of the Perth National Water Account again. Would it be possible for you to flick back to that slide, Janice, and talk us through it in a little bit more detail, please?
Okay. Is this one you're talking about, Merrin? Okay.
Just waiting for Merrin to type into the box, everyone. She says the new landing page.
Okay, this one here. Okay, thanks, Merrin. This is thanks for highlighting this. One of the things we have an issue with is presenting information, and a lot of information goes into all our products, but particularly into the National Water Account. And one of the issues we have is how do we present that in a summary form? What this one is showing is for the Perth region. It's just showing as a snapshot. It's showing that the rainfall over the 2014-15 financial year was 614 millimetres, and that was down from the previous years. It shows that the storages were 21% full. The stream flow was below average. It also, and this is where we're looking at in terms of the accounting, it talks about the assets in terms of a water account. What are the assets in terms of the volume in storage, the rainfall, any water that's transferred into the basin, the liabilities in terms of the demands on the system, and then also inflows, outflows, and the net change in storage. This one too, and this particularly for Perth is really interesting, as I was saying, and as Nicola put into the did you know questions on the web page. It shows very clearly that for water sources in Perth, that over 50% of it comes from groundwater, but then more and more of the water is coming from desalination and from recycled water. And then the bottom line tells us about water use and identifies where exactly the water's going to.
That was great. Thanks so much, Janice. We have a second question. Just bear with me. What is the general situation in the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment, and is this lower than in previous years?
That's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because when we do, well, firstly, because the Murray-Darling Basin is such a big basin, that to say on average, so even for example, if you have a look at our water storages product and go to the Murray-Darling Basin, it will give you an estimate of an average of the storages across the Murray-Darling Basin. So, for example, it's saying that at the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment, the storage is 33.7% full. But if you go to individual dams, so for example, Copeton Dam, as I was using as an example, is 15.9%. Keepit Dam on the neighbouring basin to the Guarda is only 9.6. So it really depends on whereabouts in the Murray-Darling Basin you're looking, because it is such a huge area. But in general terms, the storages are quite low, and lower than they have been for quite a while. In terms of the outlook, I was talking to our climate people today, and it does look like we're moving away from the El Nino that we were in last year, and that we're moving in either to a neutral situation, or there's a 50% probability of us moving into a La Nina. So in broad general terms, it looks like our storages are low, but it looks like we will be getting the outlook for the climate outlook is looking better for the Murray-Darling Basin than it has in previous years.
Lovely, thanks so much. We don't have any more questions through the webinar text box, but I'll just double check with the audio listeners. Does anyone on the phone have any questions for Janice? Everyone's on mute, so this may take a while just to get through, just to check that there are or there aren't. Nope. Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks everybody for taking the time to join us today, and thanks so much to Janice for taking the time out to prepare this webinar and to provide such a comprehensive array of information. It's been really interesting. I've definitely learned a lot. I want to just draw everybody's attention to the fact that I'll be sending around an email later on today. This email will contain the slide information that Janice provided with all the links, so that you can go in and have a look at some of the tools and information provided on the website, and also the opportunity to subscribe to the newsletters that the Bureau offers. It'll also contain a very short feedback questionnaire, so that we at AWA and the Bureau can develop our webinars to be even more successful in the future. We're really, really keen to be able to improve on any aspects that you have recommendations on, or to also flag what you found particularly useful and what you'll be able to take into your workplaces or academic lives to use the data in meaningful ways. We'll also be providing a recording of this webinar. We need to make sure that that's all set up, so I'll be sending you a second email with that content on. Somebody via the webinar questions mentioned whether or not we'd be able to provide the PowerPoint slide content. It is a very, very large file, so I'll need to talk to Janice about what options we may have for that and what material we can send. It might be that we can provide a selection potentially. As Janice said earlier, you can see the Bureau at Ozwater. They have a presenter delivering a talk as well as a stand. So if you're attending the event, then I do encourage you to go put some faces to names and have a chat. I think that's probably all from me. If you do have any questions over the next couple of days that you think of whilst you're testing out the tools and having a reflect upon the things that you've learned today, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. You'll have all my contact details via email, and I can certainly pass material over to Janet. So yes, I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope you found it very useful, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.